Hello, welcome back. My name is Ari, and as you were probably aware, May was AAPI month and the Asian Readathon happened, and so I kind of took place in the Asian Readathon. I didn't specifically find books for the prompts. I just read books by Asian authors and then used them to fill the prompts. So in this video, that's what we're doing. We are doing a recap of Asian Readathon and talking about the books by Asian authors I read and what prompts they filled. So I'm going to do the prompts a little bit out of order, and you'll find out why later. Before we get into the prompts and what I read, there are 5 prompts, and the goal for me was to read 5 different books for all 5 prompts, and each book needs to be by an author from a different Asian country. So 5 Asian countries, 5 prompts. I ended up reading 7 books, but did not fill all of the prompts to my specifications. So we'll go through that, go through the prompts, talk about the books I read. Here we go. So the first prompt was a book by an Asian author. All 7 books I read were by Asian authors. Duh. But the one that I had specifically to fill this prompt was A People's History of Heaven by Mathangi Subramanian. I can't say her last name. Anyway, this is by an Indian writer, and this takes place in India in a slum in Bangalore called Heaven. And it follows a group of young girls who are school children who've grown up in the slum. They're kind of a bridge to a new generation. Their parents, or their mothers, grew up knowing that they had to marry, and that's kind of why most of the mothers are in the slum, is because their husbands left them, their husbands passed away, they weren't able to marry, different things like that. But a woman's education was not important, it was just marrying well. And so for the younger girls, their mothers want them to get an education. They want them to be able to support themselves as best as they can, and it's kind of an interesting story along those lines. The government is about to destroy the slum, but there's only about a month left until the girls finish high school. So there's protest, and then you have the protesting central story with a background story of little snippets of each one of these women's lives. It's not religious like the title implies, which is why I put off reading it for so long, because it sounds religious, but it is very interesting, very moving, very feminist. So ignore the heaven part of the title, and if you like empowered and feminist women, highly recommend. The next prompt I'm going to talk about is A Universe Different Than Yours, which for that I read Siren Queen by Nihi Vo. She is a Chinese author, and this is interesting because it takes place in our universe, but it's magical realism. So this takes place in the golden age of Hollywood, and our main character is a first generation Chinese immigrant, and she is trying to become a movie star, but Hollywood in this universe is a fake court, almost deals with the devil to be able to become famous or even get noticed by the bigwigs of Hollywood. And it's all mystical, all magical, and it reads like she's just traveling through a fake court. So it's very, very interesting. This is so far my favorite book by Nihi Vo, and it's kind of a mix between that magical realism and historical fiction. So if you like historical fiction with a touch of magic, you'll probably like this, and if you like magic and don't mind a touch of historical fiction, you'll probably like this. But basically it deals a lot with feminism and racism, so highly recommend. The next prompt is a cover worth googly eyes. So just a really, really pretty cover. Now this is always going to be subjective, and what I think is a pretty cover might be something you don't think is a pretty cover. But for this, I chose Monstrous Volume 2 by Marjorie Liu. Marjorie is Taiwanese American, and then the illustrator is Japanese. So Monstrous is kind of hard to explain, but it is fantasy, and it follows a universe where there are humans, but there are also like animal-human hybrids, and they have been at war. And technically the war is over, but nothing has really been resolved, and the monster human, or the animal-human hybrids are being enslaved, and people are still killing each other, and it's very dark. But our main character is kind of trying to follow her mother's footsteps, because her mother had done something to her, and she's trying to figure out what the hell her mother has done. But her mother's dead, and you know, a bunch of drama happens. This is really good. It's really interesting. It's very complicated though, but I would definitely recommend picking up Monstrous if you're interested. Next is a highly rated book, and the book that I read for this has a 4.31 on Goodreads, which is very highly rated in my opinion, and it is Crying in H Mart by Michelle Zauner. She is a Korean American author, and this is a memoir. She is the lead singer of a band called Japanese Breakfast, which I had never heard of before this. I have no idea who this woman was. The only reason I'm reading her memoir is because it won like best memoir on Goodreads Choice, and I always read all the winners of Goodreads Choice. So yeah, this was really about her mother dying of cancer, and her like memories of her mother trying to like, it's about just like her caring for her mother through her cancer diagnosis and death, and just like her feelings and, you know, all of that stuff. This was okay. If I knew who she was, I may have liked it more, and if I like had any of the same experiences she did, I may have liked it more. But this is like the third or fourth book I've read about Asian women who treated their mothers like shit growing up. And it's just not an experience that I've had. I don't treat my mother badly, and I wasn't like the best child in the world, but I never like just actively hated and treated my mother like she wasn't worth anything. And so I don't really understand like where this comes from or why these are stories. So it's not for me, and I struggle to relate. Also, my mother is not sick. She doesn't have cancer or anything like that, so that also like makes me unable to relate. So it's just not an experience that I've had. I'm glad I read it to, you know, like read about other people's lives, other people's experiences, things that I haven't experienced, and kind of like get a different perspective. But it's not something that I like loved. I recommend it to anybody who is interested in it. All right, the last prompt is an older woman Asian main character, right? So an Asian woman over 30. I did read 2 books that qualify for this prompt, but they're both by Korean authors, and I had already filled the Korean author spot with Crying in H Mart. So I'm going to talk about those 2. So the first one was The Vegetarian by Han Kang. This one is not about, or this one I thought was body horror, and about like being a vegetarian. This is not, is about mental health. The main character in this book is schizophrenic, and she has a dream, and because of the dream she doesn't want to eat meat anymore, and her family is not okay with this, and then just everybody's mental health just declines especially hers, as she gets more and more into the schizophrenia, and her family, instead of like helping her, they just kind of abandon her for their own selfish reasons. We don't have any chapters from her perspective. The first part is from her husband's perspective. The second part is from her brother-in-law's perspective, so her sister's husband. And then the third part is from her sister's perspective. But yeah, it's about mental health. So I went into this expecting something completely different from what I got, just because of how it's marketed, and I think I disliked it because of that. Like, if I went into this knowing that it was about schizophrenia, I probably would have just had a different headspace going into it. But as it is, I gave it 3 stars. It wasn't really, like, it wasn't at all what I expected. I didn't particularly enjoy it, but I don't discourage anybody else from reading it. I don't know how well the mental health representation is, because I don't have schizophrenia. I don't know anybody who has schizophrenia. I'm not a medical expert, but yeah. So if you think you're going into this looking for body horror and like gross stuff, you're not gonna get it. It's entirely about mental health. But the main character is over 30, so would have qualified for that prompt if this wasn't Korean. And this is also translated fiction, so just extra information. The next book that I read, also from Korea, was The Mermaid of Jeju, and this is historical fiction, and it's an audiobook that I read. The audiobook was fantastic, so if you like reading audiobooks, I definitely recommend this one. But this is post-World War II. During World War II, Korea was under Japanese control, and after Japan was devastated at the end of the war, Korea was divided into North and South Korea. The Americans took like conservatorship of South Korea, and Russia, or the Soviet Union, took conservatorship of North Korea, with a like plan in mind through the UN to after a few years unite them once the Korean government can support themselves. Like, it's all a bunch of bullshit, but it is kind of important to the story. But Jeju Island's in South Korea, and it follows a young mermaid, basically. Hanyo, I believe is the phrase, but I could be pronouncing that wrong. But they're women who dive for fish and oysters and different things like that, and support themselves as deep sea divers, collecting, you know, different ocean creatures to sell. And you have this young girl, and she is a Hanyo, a 3rd generation. Her grandmother was, her mother is, and she is. She's sent on an overnight trip to sell some of these fish things. I don't know a lot about fish, but she's sent to sell some stuff, and when she returns, her mother has been killed in a diving accident. Originally her mother was supposed to go on this trip, but she had begged to go, begged for the responsibility, and now she blames herself for her mother's death, because it should have been her instead of her mother, if that makes sense. But we follow this character through the first part of the book. The book starts off with her as a very old woman in America, and then we go back to her childhood and kind of see how she ended up in America and how she ended up with her husband. The second part is from her husband's perspective, so that is really cool, and towards the end it gets kind of like mystical and magical. There's a little bit about ghosts and stuff like that. But this was really interesting to read. I learned a lot about post-World War II in Korea that I had no idea, because I've only been exposed to like the Americanized or Western version of what happened in World War II. You don't really learn a whole lot about what happened in Asia in World War II unless you specifically study that. So I recommend this book for people who like historical fiction but they're sick of the same World War II story, because this is a completely different story than what you've read, and also people who just want to like learn more about Korean culture and how North Korea and South Korea kind of like came about instead of just a unified Korea. So highly recommend this one. It was really interesting, and a good way to learn historical information but in like a fantastical type of story. The final book that I read was Romina by Junji Ito. Junji Ito is Japanese, and this is a horror graphic novel. This is very weird. It's like sci-fi horror where a guy discovers a black hole and then a planet comes through the black hole, and then that planet heads straight to Earth and it's hungry. And it's kind of about that, but it's also about like he had named the planet after his daughter Romina, and then it's like the human reaction to like she's a curse and stuff like that. If you are a stickler for physics being accurate, don't read this book, because the physics in here are just the most absurd, like not remotely accurate thing ever. It kind of bothered me a little bit and probably like lowered my overall rating, because I had a very hard time suspending any sort of disbelief that any of the things in this book could have happened, because it was just like that's not how things work. Can't really do that. But if you want just like a weird like horror, this is definitely weird. So yeah, I don't have a strong opinion on this. I think I gave it 3 stars because there were aspects that I liked and then there were aspects that I did not like at all. But I got nothing. All right, and that is everything. Thank you for being here. Let me know down in the comments your favorite book by an Asian author that you read in May. If you didn't read any books by an Asian author or didn't have a favorite, then leave me a vegetable emoji down in the comments below in honor of the vegetarian, even though it's not really about being a vegetarian. But I will see you on Tuesday for the next video.